Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, an unrehearsed panel discussion of the U.S. government's wars and the racism they inspire. On a day on which 2 generations of U.S. war against the Middle East has resulted in new blowback, an attack in Brussels, Belgium, that has killed dozens of people. Our program is presented by members and friends of AWARE, a local peace group. AWARE is an acronym for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. AWARE was established 14 years ago after the blowback attacks of 9/11-2001 by citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that the U.S. government would use those crimes to justify its already long-standing attempts to exercise military control over the Middle East and its energy resources. The U.S. doesn't need oil from the Mideast, but Mideast gas and oil are needed by America's major competitors in Europe and Asia. So control over them gives the U.S. a major advantage over China, Germany, and other countries. And that control benefits only the economic elite, the 1% in the U.S. The U.S. wars are not in the news. The presidential candidates are a distraction while the U.S. government continues to kill people around the world. Interestingly enough, while Hillary Clinton, having trouble with my script here today, while Hillary Clinton was affirming her loyalty to the right-wing Israeli government at a meeting of the Israel lobby group AIPAC yesterday, Donald Trump was questioning the need for NATO and outlining a non-interventionist foreign policy in a meeting with the Washington Post's editorial board. Trump's criticisms of the Bush-Obama-Clinton war policy of the last 15 years have sent the most rabid Republican pro-war neocons fleeing from the Republican Party and joining the Clinton campaign, which they can count on being pro-war and pro-Wall Street. Hillary Clinton, in addition to her support for the ongoing wars in the Mideast, is a long-standing advocate of Social Security reform, which means cuts, and trade pacts that benefit the 1%. Trump pledged not to touch Social Security and has opposed the trade pacts, as well as the invasion of Iraq. And he's criticized Obama and Clinton's war on Libya. Perhaps even more important, he rejected the Obama administration's immensely dangerous provocation of Russia and Obama's encouragement of mass murder in the proxy war in Ukraine. Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump's anti-war statements are part of their popularity. Remember that the anti-war movement in the U.S. was crucial to Obama's election both times, in 2008 and 2012, against McCain and against Romney. And Obama betrayed it both times by expanding the wars. Today, the Obama administration continues to bomb and assassinate people around the world and manages largely to distract Americans from what they're doing. Obama's real accomplishment as president has been to hide American war-making from the American people. Most Americans don't realize that President Obama has attacked 8 countries, 2 more than President Bush, and is today sending U.S. troops into no less than 3/4 of the countries in the world. There are more than 70,000 of these special operation forces, U.S. special operation forces, and they report only to the President's National Security Council. Their operations include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. Meanwhile, the President's continuing drone assassinations, the New York Times says he chooses the targets himself, have already killed thousands, including U.S. citizens and hundreds of children. In addition to conducting wars throughout the Mideast, the Obama administration is acting with belligerence towards China and promoting an ongoing proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, which has already killed more people than Israel killed, with U.S. permission, in Gaza in 2014. President Obama says he's fighting terrorism, the Islamic State, and al-Qaeda, but America's worldwide violence is creating terrorists, not defeating them. Worse, the U.S. today covertly cooperating with those terrorists, the people who committed 9/11, notably in Syria. They make up the opposition that the U.S. is supporting against the Syrian government. The U.S. created modern jihadism, modern terrorism, Islamic terrorism, 40 years ago during the Carter administration, when the U.S. collected the most fanatic Islamists it could find and sent them into Afghanistan specifically to harass the Russians and, quote, give the Soviets a Vietnam of their own, as President Carter's national security advisor said. At the time, the Russians had not sent troops into Afghanistan in support of the Afghan government. Although that was indeed control of Mideast energy resources that was the real reason, the Bush and Obama administrations launched wars in the Mideast and killed well over 1 million people with the propagandistic excuse that they were fighting terrorism. But what, after all, is terrorism? There are, in fact, official definitions in U.S. and British law and in U.S. Army manuals, all about the same. Terrorism is defined as the calculated use of violence or threat of violence to attain goals that are political, religious, or ideological in nature through intimidation, coercion, or instilling fear, close quote. In other words, the military operations themselves of the Bush and Obama administrations fall under the definition of terrorism. In fact, state-directed international terrorism in the technical sense of U.S. and British law. But when the U.S. government and media refer to terrorism, we all know that they mean terrorism practiced by foreigners against us, not the terrorism, often more extreme, practiced by the U.S. and its clients against others, particularly in the Middle East. So it becomes clear that Noam Chomsky is correct when he says everyone's worried about stopping terrorism. Well, there's a really easy way: stop participating in it. He's pointed out that Obama's secret drone program is the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times. 40 years ago, the U.S. government withdrew from an illegal war because Americans demanded it. By 1978, polls showed that 72% of the U.S. population regarded the war in Vietnam as not a mistake, but as fundamentally wrong and immoral. As in Southeast Asia then, so now in Southwest Asia, the U.S. must end its criminal wars. We must demand that President Obama and his successor, probably Clinton, 1, end the drone assassinations, 2, bring all U.S. troops and weapons home, 3, close the 1,000 foreign U.S. bases around the world. No other country has more than 12. 4, end the provocations of Russia in Ukraine and China in the South China Sea. 5, end support for Israel's apartheid policy and stop sending them money and weapons. And 6, support negotiations among the U.S., Russia, and their clients to end the Syrian and Iraqi civil wars. In a book on the last presidential campaign, President Obama is quoted as follows: "Turns out I'm really good at killing people," Obama said quietly. "Didn't know that was going to be a strong suit of mine." However ironically he meant it, the quote has not been denied by the White House, and it turns out to be true. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war making this week, but you won't hear much of it about it in the American media. We'll mention some of it tonight, beginning with Ron Zook.
Yes. My procedure tonight will be to skip through a few headlines and then come back perhaps to those that seem especially suggestive. So here goes. This will be somewhat disconnected at first.
I've set a standard for disconnection tonight, so go right ahead.
Right. Okay, what's going on in the South China Sea? The USA is raising hell, shall we say, in the language of the streets, about the Chinese attempt to build up these little islands, the Paracels and the Spratlys in the South China Sea, and claiming that this is a terrible example of Chinese aggression, and they have no right to those islands. And this shows that they're aggressive and warlike intent if they continue to build up these very small uninhabited coral reefs and atolls in the South China Sea. And it looks as if this is Chinese expansionism. Okay, the other news of the week then is, or something that looks like, American expansionism. Now the USA has leased a base in Darwin, Australia, in the North Territory there. And there's an interesting story about it here. I'm sorry, it's the Chinese leasing Darwin, and the USA has reached an agreement for 5 stations in the Philippines over here. So this again is proof of Chinese expansionism. They're on the northern edge of Australia. They are expanding into the area around Darwin, and the USA into other Philippine islands. There's long been a major American base at Subic Bay, which has dropped out of use in the past few years. But okay, we have this propaganda war going on, claim and counterclaim, about who is expanding and showing themselves to be an imperialistic power who's trying to subjugate all of the southern Pacific. U.S. casts wary eye on Australian port leased by Chinese. Darwin, the port in this remote northern Australian outpost, is little more than a graying old wharf jutting into a crocodile-infested waters. On a recent day, there was stifling heat, but not a ship in sight. Our pissy little port, as John Robinson, a flamboyant local tycoon, called it. The financially hurting government of the Northern Territory was happy to lease it to a Chinese company in October for the bargain price of $361 million, raising money for local infrastructure projects. We are the last frontier, and you take what you can get, said Mr. Robinson. The Northern Territory doesn't have the money for development, and Australia doesn't have it. We need the major players like China. So I will balance that with the other story from the Philippines. These are the new U.S. military bases near the South China Sea. China isn't impressed. Washington Post, March 21st. The disputed South China Sea will soon see increased U.S. military activity from 5 Philippine bases, following the signing of a deal between Manila and Washington that will allow the Pentagon to deploy conventional forces to the Philippines for the first time in decades. The deal, called an Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, was reached Friday between State Department officials and the government of the Philippines, and will allow the Pentagon to use parts of 5 military installations in the Philippines. It comes at a time when the United States and its allies in the region have expressed concern about China increasingly deploying military assets to man-made islands in the South China Sea. So the State Department spokesman John Kirby, a retired 2-star Navy admiral, said that the United States has made absolutely no bones about the fact that we take the rebalance to the Asia-Pacific region very seriously. But he added there's nothing offensive or provocative about any of the Pentagon's deployment of troops to the region. So it's open, of course, to the Chinese to make the same kind of claim about their expansion into the South China Sea, that there's nothing offensive or provocative about that either. So it's a matter of I guess, of who's doing it. The next point, next headline, back to the Middle East. Israel calls on UN to punish Iran for missile tests. New York Times, March 14th. Israel called on the United Nations Security Council on Monday. I'm really incoherent today. To punish Iran for testing missiles capable of reaching Israel, which the Israelis said was a sign that the Iranians could not be trusted to honor the nuclear agreement reached last year. Iran's interests can no longer be hidden, the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Danny Danon, told reporters as the Council began a private session at the request of the United States to discuss last week's missile tests. Mr. Dannon brought with him a photograph of an Iranian missile that appeared to be inscribed with the phrase, "Israel must be wiped off the face of the earth," in Persian and Hebrew. The provenance of that photograph, which appeared to be the same as one published by Iran's Fars news agency, has not been confirmed, and so on and so on. So once again, Israel is telling the USA to attack Iran because we consider Iran a threat to us. And we call upon you to do this. And of course, if you don't, you're anti-Semites. And so it goes. Israel raids Palestinian TV station accused over unrest. Ramallah, now this is Agence France Presse in March 11th. Israeli forces on Friday raided the Ramallah Palestinian territories television station accused of inciting violence, the security services said, after the government approved new measures to combat unrest. The Shin Bet security agency said in a statement that the station, Palestine Today, backed the Islamic Jihad militant group and had been helping to fuel a 5-month wave of violence. So is this a completely understandable thing or a horrible violation? Well, again, it turns out to depend on who's doing it and their presumed political inclinations. Next headline, U.S. Navy may raise current 308-ship target for the fleet. The U.S. Navy will likely increase its requirement for a 308-ship fleet, given the rapidly changing world security situation, including the U.S. battle against Islamic State, the Chief of Naval Operations, John Richardson, said on Thursday. This is Reuters, March 11th. Richardson said the Navy was reviewing an assessment completed in 2012 and updated in 2014 before Russia's reemergence as a global power competitor and the start of a U.S.-led campaign to defeat the Islamic State militants in Iraq and Syria. I would bet a paycheck that it's going to be a number greater than 308 ships, just by virtue of the additive nature of complexity and the contestants that are confronting us right now, Richardson told an event hosted by the Washington defense consultant, Jim Elise, and Credit Suisse. So, next article. The U.S. Navy, this is an opinion article in the Wall Street Journal, March 10th. The U.S. Navy's new $13 billion aircraft carrier will dominate the seas. A $13 billion U.S. aircraft carrier is about to hit the open seas. It's the USS Gerald R. Ford, CVN-78, the most expensive and most advanced warship ever built. The Navy behemoth can house more than 4,500 people and weighs 90,000 tons. It's the lead ship in the Ford class of aircraft carriers, replacing some of the U.S. Navy's existing Nimitz-class carriers. So there's some more here about the technical details, the technological apparatus on board for launching missiles and projectiles and so on. In drills, U.S. and South Korea practice striking North nuclear plants and leaders. I may have mentioned this earlier, March 7th, in our program then. The United States and South Korea kicked off major military exercises on missile facilities and, quote, decapitation raids, end of quote, by special forces targeting the North leadership. So the drills always elicit an angry response from Pyongyang, but Monday's statement was particularly ferocious, accusing the United States and South Korea of planning a beheading operation aimed at removing Kim Jong-un's regime. Next headline, Voice of America, March 4th. The U.S. sends aircraft carrier and destroyers to South China Sea. The United States has deployed an aircraft carrier and several escorts to the South China Sea in an apparent show of force to China. The John C. Stennis, along with 2 destroyers and 2 cruisers, reportedly arrived in the disputed waters earlier this week. A U.S. flagship is also in the region. So the point of all of this is that we seem to be building toward war, and not just any little regional war, but war with China, which I think is a very serious matter indeed, of world historical significance. And I can't see any good coming of it. So once again, this week, I have my little reminder here, the memento mori. More people dying every day. The killing, shooting, burning, bombing goes on endlessly. And again, I'm not sure what we can do about it, except keep hammering at the theme that most or all of this is unnecessary. It's criminal, it's evil, and we should do everything we can to stop it. And there I'll stop.
Thank you, Ron. You're watching News from Neptune. Let me try that one more time. I've been away. It's been a while. You're watching Aware on the Air, our attempt each week to talk about U.S. war policy, which is not covered by American media, and the interest behind it, and the racism that it inspires. I think that today we are particularly aware of the blowback effect, the blowback attacks in Brussels, in Belgium. Dozens of people have been killed by bombings at the airport in Brussels and in the subway system. And the Islamic State group in the Middle East has taken credit, if that's the word, for the killing, but it is a ongoing issue for the U.S. and the EU in terms of how to deal with terrorism. The way in which the U.S. has dealt with terrorism for more than a generation has been to attack it and to increase it. When the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq occurred in the early 21st century, there was no essential terrorist attacks outside of the Middle East, and the appearance of the 9/11 attack was a blowback, a response to what the U.S. had done in the Middle East for the better part of a generation. The people responsible for the 9/11 crimes said they did it because they were appalled at the U.S. Sanctions on Iraq, which the U.S. Secretary of State admitted killed 500,000 children. They were appalled at the U.S. military in the Islamic holy places in Saudi Arabia, and they were appalled at the treatment of the Palestinians by the U.S. clients Israel, and that the response, the attacks on New York and Washington on 9/11, 2001, were blowbacks, were counterattacks to what had occurred in the U.S. activity in the Middle East. What do you make of what happened in Brussels today, Ron? Do we have a continuation of the blowbacks, or have things changed?
Well, it may be a bit of both, but yeah, it's hard to quickly pronounce judgment on things like that. The initial reports were about 20 dead, and then I got
that's
another,
doubled now almost,
yeah,
I think.
Then I got another report this morning. There were about 200 dead, and so who knows what to...
200 injured, they were saying.
Is that it? Okay.
That level,
yeah, who knows what to believe. And so there are many possible interpretations, and we're caught up in this chaos of conflicting interpretations, people trying to tell us what it means and what it was all about. And it's become one of the most abused words, I think, in political discussion and propaganda. Today is telling us what various events were about. I'm not sure what they're.
That's our job here to wear on the air,
I
isn't it?
see. I see. Okay. What was the 20th century about, Carl? I don't know. But anyway.
If you want a short answer, it was about the spread of American capitalism.
I see,
Isn't that
okay.
fair? It was the American century.
Yeah, okay.
Or hadn't you heard?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've heard of that one.
Yeah, that's right. Sure. Well, the question also may be what the 21st century is about, and what the U.S. as the major player, the major actor in worldwide war and economy is up to. And it strikes me as quite remarkable that issue in the largest form, or even in terms of specifics, is remarkably absent from the presidential debate, from the debates, not only the debates, but the campaigns that are being waged by the various presidential candidates in the U.S. right now. Foreign policy doesn't seem to be much of a concern. And we had a little break in that yesterday when Hillary Clinton addressed AIPAC, the Israel lobby group, and swore undying fealty to the Jewish state and the need to carry on war and mayhem in its support, as the American government has done for years. People were surprised at how belligerent she in fact was, and the part of the explanation was that her probable opponent in the fall election, Donald Trump, has said that he wants to maintain neutrality between Israel and Palestine. Now, this is a very bad word in the point of view of the supporters of Israel, who think there can be no such neutrality, and Mrs. Clinton did exactly what she was asked to do by the Israel lobby, and insisting that Trump's words were outrageous and to be rejected. So you have the peculiar phenomenon of, on at least one issue, and perhaps on further foreign policy issues, the Republican putative nominee, Donald Trump, being to the left of the Democratic putative nominee, Mrs. Clinton, who has been a pro-war and pro-Wall Street candidate all along. What do you make of that?
Well, I don't think the left-right business has any application here. But
well, let me say it a different way then. That one is more belligerent and pro-war, and one is less belligerent and less pro-war.
Yeah. Well,
we normally assume the opposition to the war to be on the left, and support for the war to be on the right. So I'll dispense with left and right, and simply talk about pro-war and anti-war.
Okay, Carl.
Trump's anti-war positions have been so outrageous to the Republican neocons that a number of their most visible members, like Robert Kagan, spouse to Victoria Nuland, have announced that they're abandoning the Republicans because they're not warlike enough and going over to Mrs. Clinton. Now, if you don't want left and right, that's fine. How about pro-war and anti-war?
Okay, Carl, we know you're lying. Democrats start wars, Republicans end them, and so on.
Well, that's literally true since
I
the
see.
Second World War.
Okay.
But I mean, look, Korea and Vietnam are the examples.
Right. Okay, Carl.
But I'm asking you what you think about the fact that we have presidential candidates who seem to be playing roles opposite to the roles predicted for them by the conventional wisdom. What do you make of that?
I think that's baloney, but anyway. What a remarkable display yesterday when Clinton spoke to AIPAC of declaration of thraldom, of fealty to a foreign power.
Exactly.
How could this happen? And in some quarters it would be classified, maybe with a little exaggeration, as treason. But there it is. Whatever Israel does, we're going to support them, stand behind them, stand beside them. And did Donald Trump and his speech deviate from that in any way? This is one of the points that Hillary made, that one day Trump says he's going to be neutral. The next day he says he's going to wholly support Israel. And then who knows what he'll say on Wednesday. And well, it's a problem. Trump will say anything depending on what comes into his head at the moment, and he has no problem in contradicting himself every day, every few minutes, and so on. And I don't attach any significance to anything that he says, but apparently some people say we shouldn't bother with that anyway, that he says what he means, and means what he says, and he's such a successful businessman that he will get things done. So he's never been elected to any kind of office before, but that counts in his favor. He's not a politician. He's a businessman, and we must admire these successful businessmen and so on. So a lot of foreign observers, according to the headlines, are very afraid of Trump. Stories like that have been appearing. To what extent they are propagandistic, I'll leave it to you to judge, but a lot of people are very concerned, very upset, not just Democrats, not just the Republican establishment, but a lot of foreign observers who consider him a loose cannon, really wild man, and they're concerned.
I think you're falling into the pro-Clinton trap that has been set more or less consciously from the beginning. Some people say it's been set quite consciously. I doubt that. I think it's much more a result of the woof and warp of American politics. But the point was made by Glenn Ford, Black Agenda Report, who said that if Hillary Clinton can make the general election a crusade against Trump, a crusade against bigotry and intolerance as embodied by Donald Trump, she can win with an otherwise issueless campaign, thus shielding the 1% from harm, the bankers for whom she is finally working. If Trump, it's a godsend to the Clinton campaign to make Trump the issue. And Trump has countered that only by making the consensus on American foreign policy, American war policy, the Bush-Obama consensus on continuing war, to make that an issue. And when that is in fact what Mrs. Clinton stands for, as you rightly said, she made clear in her address to the Israel lobby, to AIPAC yesterday. Now, I think we should go back to the question that you raised before that stands behind this American political debate. How could this happen in regard to the U.S. relationship with Israel? How could this happen that the leading Democratic candidate gives this semi-fascist speech to the Israeli lobby group? And it seems to me that it's important to see that this isn't a recent or sudden change. The U.S. has supported the state of Israel roughly since 1967. In 1967, Israel started a war against its Arab enemies and essentially removed secular Arab nationalism, which threatened American interests and its control of the oil of the Middle East. It removed it from the map. They defeated Egypt. They defeated an Arab war, an Arab secular nationalist Arab movement led by President Nasser of Egypt. That's 1967. Now, the U.S., which had been relatively even-handed, you might say, in regard to the various states in the Middle East up till 1967, saw in that year that Israel would be a useful client in America's own designs on control of the Middle East. Israel could become a stationary aircraft carrier for American forces in the Middle East, and from that point on, the U.S. has built up the Israeli military capability and used Israel as a basis for its own American military capabilities throughout the region. The U.S. gives billions of dollars, literally, a year to the Israeli military, and it's not out of the kindness of the heart or even a devotion to the victims of the Holocaust or something like that. It's because the U.S. politics, the U.S. policy in the Middle East has been consistent for generations, and Israel is a major prop for it. The U.S. allows the Israelis to conduct an apartheid more vicious than that conducted by South Africa, not because the U.S. itself has anything particularly against the victims of Israeli apartheid, the Palestinians, but because the U.S. needs the State of Israel as its client, the way the Godfather needs his capos in the Middle East. And the U.S. lines up a series of capos, Israel, Saudi Arabia being at the top of the list, Turkey and Egypt being on the list as well, and the recent involvement with Iran, which has its own history on the part of the United States, is an attempt to reincorporate Iran back into this arrangement of capos under the Godfather in Washington, D.C. They're doing pretty well, but the extremity of Mrs. Clinton's expressions to the AIPAC group yesterday is right in keeping with American policy. It's just a more intense version of it, a more murderous version of it, the sort of thing we've come to expect from Mrs. Clinton. There's no departure here. It's a continuation. Comment?
Well, that's one way of looking at it, I guess. The interesting thing to me was, to shift gears somewhat here, the Obama visit to Cuba and the opening up of relations there, it appears. And I'm sure you're going to tell us that that was done for low motives and so on. But
U.S. motives remain what they often are.
Okay. And what interested me was the American media reaction to start talking continue talking about human rights. And we supposedly, or according to this line, in the USA are the great avatars of freedom, democracy, and human rights. And it's become absolutely inescapable that any time an American reporter or visitor touches the ground in Cuba, they will start talking about, complaining about the lack of human rights and start looking for some dissidents to interview so that these dissidents will denounce the government and the dictator, Fidel Castro, and it's amazing the persistence and the automatic stereotyped way in which this occurs. So if you are looking at Cuba, start talking about the terrible plight of the dissidents who are being repressed there. And you must not, of course, say anything about the plight of dissidents elsewhere. For example, in the USA, in Guantanamo, in Israel, in Saudi Arabia, and so on. There, the dissidents are merely misfits, criminals, malcontents, and so on. But in Cuba and to a large extent in China, they are holy saints and martyrs to the cause of freedom, democracy, and human rights. It's an amazing propaganda campaign and very largely successful as far as I can see. So what are these human rights that these other regimes are trying to suppress? For the first time yesterday in a long time, people were, in talking about Cuba, dusting off the old term totalitarianism. So that one is back in the news. I heard that 5 or 6 times in the news reports on PBS and NPR last time. So we have their word for it, that there's totalitarianism in Cuba, but we hear nothing about because of their treatment of supposed political prisoners and so on. But we hear nothing about that in Saudi Arabia and Israel, in the USA itself and so on, because they are suppressing the freedom of speech, and criticisms of the government are being punished severely. So it's remarkable the extent to which people are denounced for their violations of human rights, depending upon who they are and their supposed political inclinations. It's amazing. So I'm amazed at the success of this propaganda. You hear lots of people spouting this stuff back at you, that Cuba and sometimes also China are horrible violators of human rights, and they have lots of political prisoners and so on. But we seem unable to talk about the political prisoners, for example, in the USA and in Israel. Mr. Castro immediately shot back when asked about political prisoners and asked to talk about them. Said, what political prisoners? This is a standard tactic also. Stonewalling. What are you talking about? We have no political prisoners. Name one. And this is the same thing that will be used by the USA when people begin to talk about the people in prison who are in prison here for their dissident and anti-government policy activities. We have no political prisoners. What are you talking about? Who are they? Name one. And then we will, if you do name one, they will point out, well, they've violated the law. They're criminals. And so they were not political prisoners at all. They're criminal prisoners. And of course, all sides can use this line. And so it remains forever inconclusive.
I think it's important to see two things about what the U.S. is doing in its discussions about Cuba, and discussions may not be the right word. I'm talking more about what the U.S. government, what the Obama administration is saying about Cuba, and what its tame media in this country are parroting along with them. And you raise a central point. The U.S. government chooses to say that Cuba violates human rights. And that's very interesting, because I think the first question to be asked is, whom is this observation directed to by the U.S. government? It seems to me the object, when the U.S. starts talking about human rights violations in Cuba, the rest of the world looks at the United States, which imprisons more of its citizens than any other country in this world, proportionally, and absolutely in most cases, and is conducting on Cuban soil a concentration camp that's notorious around the world. That's the prison camp in Guantanamo, in violation of American law, and of its own laws. The U.S. has no trouble violating its own laws to conduct this camp, and of course in violation of international human rights standards. So the rest of the world looks at what the U.S. says about human rights in Cuba, and then looks at Guantanamo and looks at the American prison population. And it may even notice, by the way, that there's no death penalty in Cuba, but there certainly is in the U.S., and it's just been vigorously backed again by Mrs. Clinton. The rest of the world looks at this and simply laughs. They realizes this is the sort of propaganda that one might have got from Pravda in the old days of the Soviet Union, that this is propaganda that is so obviously foolish that it must have as its object only a very believing population, and that, of course, is the American population. It's the American populace to whom U.S. propaganda on Cuban human rights is addressed. The U.S. actually has other fish to fry in Cuba, and that has to do with the fact that the last generation, or even less, in South America has begun a distancing of Latin American societies from U.S. economic control. It started most notably with the Cuban Revolution in 1960, but what's happened in Venezuela, in Brazil, and Chile at one point, until we killed a lot of people in order to prevent it, over the last 50 years, over the last generation particularly, has been a departure of Latin American countries from U.S. economic control. And just as the Obama administration is working to restore the status quo ante in the Middle East for its client states, so it's doing the same thing in Latin America, in our little region over here, as a former Secretary of State said. And it's doing it with the same mixture of foul means and fairs, promoting coups, promoting proxy wars in places like Colombia, coups from Chile to Brazil, and most notably in Venezuela, and attempting now to make these increasingly independent states recur to the pattern that the U.S. has tried to insist upon. We've seen this most notably recently in Venezuela and Brazil, where the U.S. is fomenting unrest precisely to bring down insurgent governments. How successful they'll be is still open. The question is still open, but the reintegration of Cuba into the American model for Latin America is a long-term goal, because Cuba, of course, has been a beacon for these independent movements in the Latin American economy. So the Obama administration is doing the same carrot and stick routine in regard to Latin America, and specifically in regard to Cuba, as it's doing in the Middle East, and specifically in regard to Iran. These are not stupid policies, they're vicious policies, and that's the difference.
Yeah, underneath it all is the continuing desire to dominate and control the entire world, it seems to me. But,
exactly.
As long as there's even 1 square foot of territory not subject to American hegemony, domination, control, there are a lot of people who are not going to be satisfied, and will continue to talk about power projection and making America great again, and so on. If there's any part of the globe that's left that is not subject to American control, at least to the extent of veto of every political, economic, military event that may occur there. And apparently there are a lot of people, especially around the Pentagon, who are deeply unhappy that that there may be portions of the globe that are independent of complete American control. But more and more, of course, there are places in Latin America and in Africa and South Asia and so on, where people are becoming restive and realizing that they need not forever remain dominated by the Yankee dollar and American military power. So I don't know, it's a very mixed picture, and I have no guess about what's going to happen in the long run, except there are bright spots here and there, and also some very dark spots. And once again, it's a very mixed picture and ambiguous in my eyes.
It's been said that there are today 2 major threats to humanity. One is climate catastrophe, so-called global warming, and the other is nuclear war. Those 2 threats are as present today as they have ever been. We are coming more and more to understand how rapidly the climate catastrophe is approaching, how serious, much more serious than originally thought, global warming actually is, how necessary it is for governments, and particularly the government of the United States, to do something about it, and not just to sit back and let it happen. And we're also coming to understand that even in these days of supposed American worldwide military and economic hegemony, the threat of nuclear war is always present, and present in part because of the provocations, such as Ron was talking about earlier in regard to China, and also in regard to Russia, that the U.S. government engages in. So if we look at these two problems, these two threats to continued human survival, climate catastrophe and nuclear war, and then we look at the actual debate about policy such as it is that's going on in the current presidential campaign, it doesn't inspire much confidence. On the one hand, we'll assume for the moment that the important Sanders movement is defeated, as I believe it will be, and that we're faced with a choice from the major parties between Trump and Clinton in the November election. Now, on the one hand, we have Trump, who denies that global warming is an issue, and on the other hand, we have Mrs. Clinton, who is even more aggressive than her predecessors in pressing towards policies that could lead to nuclear war, and that the two of them embody, as it were, in their individual outrageousness, the two great threats to human survival. This is not a happy prospect. This is not a prospect in which we can sit back and say, well, yes, this is politics, this is business as usual, let it go. The only thing that will actually change the sort of madness, and it's madness in a directed fashion, a madness in terms of the profits of the 1%. The only thing that can change the madness of both parties, the madness of the leading candidates about the very real threats to human life, is an aroused public, a public that can reverse the war policy of Bush, Obama, and Clinton, a public that can demand action on climate from President Trump, if that should be the case, or whoever else occupies the Oval Office next year. Now, this is the sort of politics that we need, the sort of politics that has the American populace demanding that its government, whoever happens to head it, do the sorts of things that actually contribute to human safety rather than threaten it profoundly. It's not clear to me that this is going to happen.
Another ominous straw in the wind, local daily on March 18th. February heat astronomical, scientists say. AP, Earth got so hot last month that federal scientists struggled to find words describing temperatures as astronomical, staggering, and strange. They warned that the climate may have moved into a new and hotter neighborhood. This was not just another of the drumbeat of 10 straight broken monthly global heat records, triggered by a super El Nino and a man-made global warming. February 2016 it obliterated old marks by such a margin that was the most above normal month since meteorologists started keeping track in 1880. So it's serious. I mean, we've known that the global temperatures have been rising pretty steadily for decades, with the accompanying melting of the glaciers, the ice caps, and so on, and the rising of the oceans. We're already seeing a number of symptoms of that. But this last month was way out of line, and we've seen, not that it means anything for the longer term climate picture, but unseasonably warm weather now for some time locally. And it does raise the question of what will this be like in July and August. And again, it doesn't look good. That's all.
Seems to me, though, that there are some indications of a possible revitalization of American politics over against the sorry state that we find today on questions of war, global warming, etc. And that comes from the fact that the Sanders and Trump movements have escaped the control of the major parties. The neocon, neoliberal directorate of both American political parties really don't know what to do with Sanders and Trump, and they didn't really think they were going to have much problem with them. In fact, they do have a problem with them, and the reason they have a problem with them is that too many Americans are tired of what the standard politics have been in this country, even on these most important issues that we've been talking about. That movement's not going to go away. And there's a very real possibility that it could seriously hamper whichever representative of the 1% becomes president in the next election. A very good comment this week went as follows: fascism is not coming to America, and it remains highly probable that Clinton will win the presidency come November. But a very real danger exists of something like the current French situation developing. The far right becoming the sole anti-establishment force, hoovering up working class support from the left, while liberal elites club together in defense of Republican legality. I think that's right, and the possibilities of a break there is very great. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group in the 12th week of 2016. Another week in which the Obama administration's drone assassination program, the most extensive global terrorism campaign the world has yet seen, is paralleled by overwhelming police killings in the U.S., far beyond what happens in other countries. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on Facebook. And see the Facebook page for Aware for articles referred to by the panel and announcements of upcoming events, including a play reading Monday night at 7 p.m. at the Station Theater of an interesting new play. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Ron Zook, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, Karen Aram, Michael Bay, David Johnson, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.